Hey everybody, thank you so much for joining us for our third episode of Composers in Quarantine Drinking Cocktails. I'm here today with Chris Zuar, a band leader and composer based out of New York City. And Chris, thanks so much for joining us today.
Stephen, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, and what are you drinking, as the viewers want to know?
I am currently drinking an old fashioned made with rye whiskey. How about you?
I'm I'm drinking a whiskey neat. So
Beautiful.
So virtual cheers. Thanks so much for
back at
being
ya.
here, Chris.
Yeah, man, this is such a great thing you got going here.
Oh man, thank you. Yeah, I figured that honestly, composers are the people who really just are totally behind the scenes, 95% of the time. I wanted to kind of take this opportunity while we're all in quarantine to feature in a more personal way, allow composers who I'm personally a fan of to kind of share with whomever, with the world, with their fans, just a little bit more background about who they are. So Chris, you are your debut album, your debut big band album, Musings, came out in 2016. It was voted one of the best albums in Downbeat magazines of 2016. But you've also had your music performed by the WDR Big Band, the Brussels Jazz Orchestra, and you're now working on your new album called Tonal Conversations,
That's right.
which, as I understand it, actually started off as a collaboration between film and like sculpture. So there's like a really big visual component to at least the inception of that project.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So Chris, I mean, to just get things started here, I think your accolades they speak, professional accolades, they speak for themselves. Just in terms of your body of writing work being performed by those amazing orchestras worldwide, and obviously your excellent taste in cocktails. So I as
Likewise.
obviously as a big band fanatic myself, enthusiast. Maybe fanatic is slightly too strong. But as an enthusiast myself, I'm always curious as to what got people started writing, composing, and what was the shift from being an instrumentalist to being a composer, to being a composer arranger type. So yeah, let's maybe just start off with some background on you as an artist and as a musician.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the intro. I grew up in Long Island, New York. My parents still live out there in a town called Manhasset. And I took up an instrument when most people take up instruments, fourth grade, probably around 9 or 10 years old. And the trumpet seemed like a great choice. And that ended up being a big part of my life, really, from the age 9 or 10 up to when I went to college. I went to the New England Conservatory right around 2005 or so. But I should probably mention that in high school, I had the great opportunity to take a theory and composition course as just sort of like a class elective. And that's when I really caught the writing bug. I was interested in jazz and classical music pretty early on. The first, if I'm recalling this correctly, the first two records I got, probably at age 9, a compilation disc of Louis Armstrong's Hot Fives and Hot Sevens, and a recording of Wynton Marsalis and the English Chamber Orchestra performing many of the great trumpet concertos, Haydn, Hummel, etc. And I really got hooked from there. It was sort of just like an instant love affair. But sort of jumping back ahead to this class that I took in high school, it was really just sort of my first opportunity to freely explore composition and to have a mentor, this man by the name of Mark von Schenkoff, who just retired from Manhasset High School after a long tenure there. And and so, yeah, it just sort of bloomed from there. I think shortly after, I ended up taking a few lessons with a composer who you probably will know, someone named Mike Holliber, who's been an influence to many young writers of our generation. And sort of everything just took off from that moment. Sort of completely fell in love with large ensemble music, started checking out records, and I know I'm rambling, but
No, you're definitely not rambling. Very far from
cool.
it. Yeah.
That was more or less the beginning. Was that class in high school, and then starting to take some lessons with Mike, discovering all these great writers, discovering Mike's music with the Gotham Jazz Orchestra, discovering Thad Jones, Brookmeyer, Maria, all these amazing composers, and I sort of just was hooked, and I haven't looked back since.
Awesome. Yeah. So for you, it's not so much that you were a performing instrumentalist to even in high school, and then there was the switch to composing and arranging. For you, it was very much like a simultaneous marriage of just like music and interest and theory and big band and Haydn and Hummel and Skane and just so you've been writing ever since you picked up the instrument, the horn.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, not seriously. I thought I was going to be a jazz trumpet player. I mean, I went to NEC with the intent of studying jazz trumpet, but I was very interested in writing, very interested in the jazz orchestra. Brookmeyer was teaching at NEC at that point in time, so I had hopes of studying with him. Unfortunately, he was ill right around that time and sort of wasn't teaching as frequently, so I didn't get the chance to hang with him much. But once I got to NEC, it was almost immediate where I just sort of saw my path as a composer, not really as a trumpet player, and shifted.
So interesting. You know, during that time when 2005 to 2009 was about the time that I was actually attending the New England Conservatory Preparatory School.
Whoa!
I'm from Lexington, Mass, and I firsthand got to study with and be a part of Ken Shafhorst's youth jazz orchestra. So I know how amazing Ken is, both as a writer and as an educator. So did you get the chance to work with Ken and write for that ensemble?
Yeah, I did. I studied for one semester with Ken, or maybe it was 1 year. My primary teachers at NEC were Frank Carlberg, great
Who's
Finnish,
playing on your album, right?
Yeah, great pianist and composer. And I studied with Frank for a few years. And I also studied with John McNeil because I was still taking trumpet lessons at NEC. But really the big draw was this Jazz Composers Workshop Orchestra that NEC was pretty well known for. Brookmeyer started it, and Frank Carlberg took it over. And those were some of my really earliest attempts at writing big band music, and I learned so much really just from having weekly reading sessions with great student musicians.
Yeah, for sure. And then that's kind of similar, or rather that's how the BMI Workshop was inspired, which you mentioned his name before. Mike Holliber and Jim McNeely ran for many, many years in sort of like this tour de force, this dynamic duo tour de force of big band minds.
Yeah.
And Mike and you now work very closely together.
Yeah, so I've been working as Mike's copyist, his music copyist, probably since 2008 or 9. So we've been working pretty closely in that capacity for a good 10 or so years. And I would go so far as to say that that's the real crux of how I learned how to write for jazz orchestra.
Is from working with Mike.
Yeah, from copying his scores. He's such a great writer, a great craftsman, that the simple act of having to break apart his score, put it back together line by line, really just taught me a lot. Even if it was like through osmosis, not even really paying close attention to what exactly was happening in the score, but just like seeing how things are constructed on a very basic level. You do that enough times, and you start to put a few things together.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah.
Well, that's great. Yeah, Mike also obviously works at Manhattan School of Music. So you
That's
finished
right.
your undergrad degree at NEC, and obviously you're from Long Island. So when you moved back to New York, were you thinking, okay, like I really want to go to Manhattan School of Music for my master's degree? Were you thinking, okay, I just want to go to New York City to be in New York City? Where did you want to do the BMI workshop? What was your primary inspiration for wanting to?
Yeah, it was all those things, really. I mean, I always knew that I would move back to New York. As much as I love Boston, I knew I wasn't going to stick around after graduating. I knew Jim McNeely's music. I didn't know at that point in time that I would attend the Manhattan School of Music, but I knew that I wanted to at least study with him in some sort of capacity. And so the first thing I did upon return was to apply for the BMI Workshop, because I knew Mike and Jim were leading that, and I wanted to be involved. And I knew the lineage too, all the great writers that had gone through that program.
Yeah.
And maybe just from a logistics standpoint, I knew it was a way that I could get my music read monthly or bi-monthly by a great New York band. So that, that was a huge draw for me as well.
Right, it's like the NEC Composers Workshop 2.0 or 1.0, depending on how you want to look at the meta.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know. It was just sort of continuing that sort of learning atmosphere that was so great at NEC. I just, I thought I'd be a fool not to try to find a similar sort of community in New York.
So what what were some of your early big band, I dare I say, experiments? What were some of your early big band writing? Where were you pulling your influences from?
Yeah, so like I said, I was always interested in classical music from a pretty early age. Sort of my interest in jazz and other musics ran parallel, I think, and they're still in many ways running parallel for me. So I had experimented, NEC having like a long lineage of the third stream concepts, Gunther Schuller, and a lot of the great artists that had passed through those walls. I had written pieces for string quartet and big band, sort of oboe soloist and jazz orchestra. Just sort of, I guess, early attempts at bridging those two types of music. And in terms of writers, I'd say in high school, once I got to start hanging with Mike, I was checking out his record Thought Trains with the Gotham Jazz Orchestra quite a bit. Quake, which had come out several years later. He was really one of my early contemporary jazz orchestra influences.
Wow, that's so cool that you got to know Mike at such an early age.
It's kind of crazy. Yeah. The more I think about it, the more the years pass, and I realize, what our sort of capacity has been, from sort of teacher, student, mentor to friend. He's a close friend and now a colleague. It's one of the more special musical relationships that I have.
Right. Yeah, that is really special.
Of course. Oh, sorry. Continue.
I was just going to say, yeah, that is really special. I didn't mean to cut you off at all.
Yeah, I think everyone looks for a mentor, sort of regardless of the pursuit. So I feel really fortunate to have had him, and then others sort of along the way. In terms of other writing influences, pretty early on, even several years now before I met Mike, growing up in Manhasset, this town in Long Island, I had a very close childhood friend, Theo Katzman, who some of you may know from the band Wolfpack, if you're into this band. Theo and I go back quite a long ways. We played baseball together and
Awesome.
Played a lot of music together. But few people know that Theo's dad, Lee, was a world-class trumpet player. Played in many of the great big bands, Kenton, Holman, Claude Thornhill, was a member of the Tonight Show band, Buddy Rich, like kind of a
Yeah, he
who's
ran
who
the
of-
gauntlet of styles and just the history of the lineage.
Totally. Yeah. And so I remember very early on, this could have been maybe the same time, 4th or 5th grade, 9 or 10 years old, where I started checking out Stan Kenton as a result of knowing Lee. And sort of he was a featured soloist in that band, which is crazy, man. It's such beautiful recordings. And so I was checking out those Kenton records pretty early on. And while I can't necessarily call him like a deep influence on my music, he was like part of my genesis.
Kenton?
Kenton.
Awesome.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure I need to revisit all that music.
I mean, Kenton he was in part very famous amongst musicians, at least, for hiring young composers and arrangers to be writing for his band at all times.
Totally.
So he always had a fresh take on the music, just by nature of the fact that the age, the youthfulness, that excited naivete that comes from being a young composer getting to write for the Kenton band, and
Yes.
that band just had so much fire.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
And really was one of the early third stream jazz composers. Someone who was interested in writing for these super big groups, right? Essentially like a studio orchestra.
Right.
And so I'm definitely in need of revisiting all that music. But I remember some of those tapes. Yeah, we're talking about tape decks. That Theo would pass me of his dad and the Kenton band. Pretty amazing.
That's awesome, man.
Yeah, very cool.
So you were really just surrounded by some very exciting people from the time you were very young. Some very exciting musical.
I'm fortunate. I think Manhasset, if anyone knows, is certainly not known for its arts community. It's a big sports and lacrosse town, as many schools are on Long Island. But and not to rip on sports, I was a jock growing up too, all throughout high school. So no hate there. But just to say that I found some very interesting people, some sort of kindred spirits along the way, which I'm super thankful for.
Right. Yeah, for sure. So let's summarize here. So you start off in Long Island, you pick up the trumpet, you start listening to Wynton, and then you start listening to Mike Holliber. Obviously, we're skipping some steps here. You wind up at New England Conservatory. You move back to New York City. So tell us a little bit about what is the inspiration for your own band, like some background around how you started your band, because I know in addition to having your big band, you also have that fantastic project that we spoke about before we hopped on to the interview today. That features Dave Liebman and Larray and Alex Larray and John Raganese.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I suppose I would skip to the end of my master's degree at the Manhattan School of Music. This is, I guess, right around 2013, 13
Mm-hmm.
or so. I had amassed enough music that I was happy with, I guess, or I felt good enough about documenting. And so I knew that I wanted to set out to make some sort of record. And so really the first thing that came to my mind was to try to hire people that I really admired growing up. Not that I'm so much older than all these cats in my band, but these are musicians that had played on records that I sort of idolized as a teen. And so here I am in New York. These musicians all live either in the city or outside in Westchester, New Jersey, wherever. And so I set out to try to put together a band of heroes, more or less, not knowing that I would get just about all of them. I don't know. I guess I paid well enough because none of them knew who I was, so they were more or less just taking a risk. I had Mike involved in the project as a producer, and these are all his friends, and so I guess he vouched for me, and it sort of just went from there.
Right. So your album, features people like Dave Pietro, and it also features the Ferber brothers. But one of the most unique parts of your record is that you're utilizing what I think in most cases is a very underutilized instrument in the modern big band idiom, which is the human voice, and you have Joe Laurie featured on the album. It just adds such like just a beautiful element of humanness, to the sound of the ensemble. I think that's really wonderful.
Yeah, that's totally it. It's bringing in sort of the human quality, the human voice, which blends so well, so seamlessly with any number of other combinations of instruments. And I'm certainly not the first person to use that. Kenny Wheeler used that extensively on Music for Large Ensemble.
Yeah.
Another record that I was super into in high school.
Oh man, yeah, that record is just unbelievably gorgeous.
Incredible, right?
Yeah, I got to play with Kenny once, very randomly. He was doing a master class with Dave Douglas at NYU when I was attending school there, and I was part of the ensemble that that was playing. And the master class was just a master class on the music of Kenny Wheeler, and Dave Douglas was presenting it, and so I was playing with Dave, and Kenny was there. But at the end of the master class, we were playing one of his tunes, and in the middle of the tune, he was sick at the time, but his aide rolled him in his wheelchair to the front of the room and to the front of the bandstand, and he got on Dave's flugelhorn and just kicked butt. He just let loose, and Kenny, yeah. So and I mean, honestly, I only checked out that record, I think, after that. That was in 2010. For me, I was a sophomore in college. But yeah, one of the greatest records, and also does an amazing job of utilizing the human voice. And actually, that's one thing that really stood out to me about the score that you sent me, Communion, because you're using, the instrumentation that you're using is it's the big band, right? So it's got 5 woodwinds, 4 trombones, 4 trumpets, rhythm section, but you're also featuring a mandolin and a violin as well.
Yep.
So by nature of the fact that you're really shifting up the orchestration, you're getting a really the instrumentation, should I say, you're by nature shifting the sound of what the ensemble can be. Right?
Absolutely.
Before you even start on orchestration, so maybe let's dive into some more nitty gritty here. Let's talk about communion, and maybe you can talk about your approach to why did you choose to add those instruments to your ensemble, the mandolin and the violin.
Yeah, totally. So Communion is part of my collaboration with Ambiel, the Tonal Conversations.
Right.
project that I'm currently working on.
Right.
And so this piece was part of a commission by a group in Chicago. It's not a group. It's sort of an art installation called 150 Media Stream.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of this sculptural video screen that's in the lobby of a commercial building right on the river. And it's 150 feet long. And so this was one of
Hence the
three.
name.
Yeah, one of three pieces that I wrote for that commission. And I should mention that my partner, Ann Beal, who's a super talented animation artist and filmmaker, has been making really incredible hand-painted animations for this entire project. So she works predominantly in watercolor. And you can imagine sort of, I'm sort of understanding more and more about animation as we go along, but it's an insane amount of paintings, like getting into the thousands if you think sort of 12 frames per second. The painting numbers sort of starts to stack up pretty rapidly. So this piece in particular, Communion, is inspired by the place where Anne grew up, which is Western North Carolina, right outside of Asheville, in the mountains, which are, I don't know if you've ever been down in that part of the country, but it's super beautiful, super idyllic. And so I think right before I started writing this piece, we had gone on a trip to visit Anne's hometown and just spent sort of a week in that beautiful part of the country. And the sort of the basis of the compositional process is centered around this tree cricket called a katydid. And the reason why it's called a katydid is because that's the sound that it makes at night as it chirps. Katydid, katydid, that sort of rhythmic pattern. And so another integral part I should mention of this collaboration is we're taking soundscapes from areas, regions, places in the world that are significant or important to us. And so we had taken several sound recordings of these groupings. Now, that bear in mind that these katydids exist up in trees, and you get groupings of trees, and you get all sorts of interesting cross rhythms between the choirs of bugs, sort of this glorious cacophony. And it's a very rigid sound, but it's really beautiful, I found. And if you checked out the end of the piece, there's actually a sound recording of the bugs.
Oh, I didn't know what that was, but
yeah, that's actually.
But I knew that it
those
fit.
Are the bugs.
I knew that it fit. I knew it was a part of the music, but I didn't realize that it was that integrally a part of the inspiration for the piece at such a fundamental level.
Totally, and in terms of like the actual material that I generated from that, it's not super specific, meaning I didn't transcribe bug patterns or anything like that. It was more just sort of associative to the general sort of sensation that I had while listening to these groups of bugs. So what I was going for sort of in the introduction was to have all these sort of cross layers, this counterpoint of rhythm all happening, these different groupings. It's sort of in a weird time signature, sort of 3 bars of 7 and a bar of 6, but the bars of 7 are broken up sort of in different ways, and sort of just taking different groupings of eighth notes and seeing what it would sound like to have duple and triple meters happening simultaneously, and the different sort of polyrhythmic effects that you might get. So that's sort of the idea there. In terms of the orchestration, it just seemed pretty natural for me to sort of include instruments that are sort of how would you say most native to that part of Appalachia. Thinking about sort of Appalachian roots, folk music, banjos, mandolin,
Right.
violin, of course, or fiddle as they would call it there.
Who is the violin soloist on this recording?
Yeah, so it's Sarah Caswell.
Awesome, and she's a frequent collaborator of Miho's as well. Miho Hazan.
Yeah, she's such an amazing musician. It's a really hard part that I wrote for her. Maybe it doesn't sound that way, but it's supposed to come across in a very free, sort of stereotypically Appalachian small group sort of vibe. But it's sort of laid on top of this very complex rhythmic cycle.
Right.
So it sounds a lot freer than it's actually notated, which I'm thankful for.
Hey, that's the goal, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But that's why you call the best.
That's why you call the baddest. All right, so walk us through a little bit some specifics of your score here. This is so interesting. I mean, my first take is that after hearing you talk about the what are the names of the crickets again?
They're called katydids.
Katydids. After listening to you talk about the katydids, my first impression is that you've put the katydid sound spread out in a percussive nature around the ensemble, starting in the trumpets, in various mutes, and I see here in the clarinet as well. Then you have this really interesting piano figure that kind of becomes an ostinato throughout at least the introduction to the piece, and it's not till later around measure 25 that we start to get into like some more modal, let's say, exploration.
Yeah.
Like diving into the harmony in a deeper way. So maybe you can walk us through some of how you approach that and just building up. This is such one of my favorite parts of listening to this piece. Of course, my own listening habits. I listen to it and then I listen to it with a score. And you're absolutely right. The notation makes it look a certain way, but the performance of the piece and obviously the way that you've intended it, the way that you've written it, is intended to sound very free, and it comes across that way. But what's really, really nice about it is that it has this beautiful build throughout, and you enter this vibe. I can almost hear, or rather I can almost feel the fact that you're like sitting in between like 3, 4, 5 different choirs of crickets.
Yeah, I'll just say it's a trip to try to conduct it, just because if you pay too closely attention to one rhythmic pattern, it can throw you way off.
Right.
So you sort of have to have your head down in the score, and I have the beaming pattern sort of laid out there in the first 4 bars, but it's still pretty tricky to sort of navigate your way through it. So pretty much the first, I'm not looking at a score, but as I can recall, the first 24 bars really before the real harmonic rhythm starts, it's really just sort of a prolongation sort of a prolongation of 5 to get to B major. And one thing that I'll mention, I didn't mention it earlier when we were talking about some influences, but Johann Sebastian Bach has sort of been my musical source from the beginning. And I know I'm not alone there. But yeah, I just thought I'd mention that little tidbit. It's hard to even call it an influence. It's just sort of like it's a guide musically. It's a source. Something that I continually come back to sort of center myself musically.
Right.
When I feel like I'm going astray in some way, I find Bach's music brings me back to it.
He just seemed to have this channel of musical energy just flowing through him at all times. Like something that I always, listening to his music, it's just like everything you want to hear, but you don't know you want to hear yet, is what he writes.
Totally.
You know, whether it's transpositions, whether it's orchestration, whether it's all of a sudden the melody from the beginning comes back again. Yeah, the guy was an absolute genius, like an absolute source, as you said. So
Yeah, you know, I mean, just to add one other thing, and I know we're light on time, but the thing that I find so fascinating about Bach is like you can look at his music in two different ways. You can look at the immense complexity, sort of like the mathematical method behind a lot of the construction of the music. But then if you just back away, I mean, it's still incredibly beautiful.
it's
And
just music.
Yeah, and the metaphor that I use, and I'm certainly not the first person to think about this, but it's like examining anything in nature, a flower, you can look at the cellular complexity of the thing up close, and then if you back away, you just see something that's beautiful. And that's sort of what I get out of Bach's music.
Right, and both are beautiful by nature.
Exactly.
So how did Bach influence your writing for Communion?
I'm not sure it specifically influenced for this piece. There's certainly much more obvious influence in sort of on some of the pieces and musings on my first record. But the one of the greatest things, sort of lessons that I've continued to try to work on over the last years is sort of the idea of obviously voice leading, reigning supreme in terms of sort of dictating much of the harmony, really. Harmony coming through melody, sort of like existing on horizontal and vertical planes at both times. But also like the importance of line. Like if you were to break down sort of a fugue or an invention of Bach's, you just see like even the way it's notated in the streams of line, whether it be 2 lines, 3 lines, or 4 lines. It's so crystal clear that's definitely something that just sort of like in a more abstract sort of influence, that it's something I think about really with anything that I write now.
When you say lines, do you mean melodies?
Yeah, whether it's melody, whether it's like counter melody that's not really supposed to have the same sort of impact, sort of like just the idea of polyphony, all of these lines occurring at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess one thing that I've thought a lot more about as a result of that is just like the idea of the inner line, or if we're looking at like maybe not so much in this piece, but some other pieces on this current project, where say like if we think about what might happen in a trombone 3 line, typically if you're looking at a sort of a tutti or a group passage, it might not be that interesting, but I'm very interested now in trying to make every line, every part musical in some way, or to pay attention to the shape of the melody, even if it's an inner line, or sort of something that's more subservient to another melody or something else going on within the sort of the structure. I don't know if that makes much sense.
No, totally. It really does. I mean, it's kind of a shift, right, from like the writing styles of someone like Sammy Nestico, where you have like, you know, that traditional trombone 3 part, which is always tied to trombone 1, right? Now you're splitting up. So instead of orchestrating, like, let's say horizontally within the ensemble, now you're actually like taking that and you're saying, okay, like what happens if I orchestrate vertically? And I give different people, different combinations of instruments, a certain color on each of these lines, and like really getting creative with the polyphony, as you put it, the polyphony, the possibilities. Wow, polyphonic possibilities.
Polyphonic possibilities.
Of
I think that's a book. You might need to write that one.
Oh man, well I'm glad I'm doing this interview series then, because I've got some amazing masters of what did I even say?
Polyphonic possibilities.
Polyphonic possibilities. Hey,
I love it, man.
There we go.